This is the Chess Quiz, Episode 1. In this first position, it's white to move. What would you play? Alright, the best move here is knight to d5. The threat is going to be bishop b6, followed by knight c7 check, forking black's king and rook. So black really can't allow that. Knight takes d5, we'll lose material to bishop takes g7. And if the rook moves, we hit the knight, rook takes, and then we grab the rook on a8. White is going to emerge the exchange up there, I believe. So castling, black could try that, but then bishop b6, and then the queen doesn't have a good way to defend this pawn on e7, since queen to e8 runs into knight c7, forking the queen and rook. So that's not working out. Maybe rook to b8 is the best try, and then we just take on f6. If the bishop takes, then we go bishop takes, and then we just grab this pawn here. White is totally winning here. So you could try e takes f6, and then we want to just attack this pawn. Black's pawn structure is really bad, and this pawn's a big target. So we'll go bishop c3. Black can defend, but we'll just increase the pressure. Bishop b4. Maybe black will try defending with bishop f8. We can castle. Now we got 3 pieces on the pawn. Bishop e6 is a try, since bishop takes d6 here would lose to rook to d8, pinning the bishop. You don't want to run into that. So instead, maybe queen f4. Now we're hitting f6, and then once black addresses that threat there, we can safely take on d6, since rook here is no longer a threat. In this next position, it's white to move. What would you play? Alright, the most decisive move here is knight takes e6. The threat is now bishop takes h7 with a discovered attack on the queen. So black's best try is just going to be queen takes e6, but then we have the brutal rook takes e7. If you take with the knight, well, that's going to run into checkmate on h7, and again, taking with the queen runs into bishop takes h7 check, knight takes, rook takes d7, and white has a winning advantage. In this position, it's black to move. What would you play? Alright, it looks kind of uncomfortable for black, but knight takes e5 can actually be played. The point is, after d takes e5, black has queen to d5, threatening checkmate. So that needs to be addressed. Let's look at some options for white. Queen to a1, we got bishop to c5, threatening the rook. The point is, if e takes f6, bishop takes a7 is a free rook, since if the queen takes, then there's the threat of checkmate. So what else can white try? Let's look at maybe g3. We got knight to g4, and if bishop takes e7, queen to f3, and checkmate is unstoppable with the queen and knight. Finally, we can look at h3, queen to d1 check, king h2. You could grab on e2, but knight to g4 check is even better. H takes, and we just take on h4. Next position, it's white to move. What would you play? Best move here is knight to g5. White gets an overwhelming advantage, and this is a nice pattern to remember in the opening when black has the knight on g6 and we have the bishop on d3. We can play this, and the point is that black can't move the f6 or h6 pawn. I mean, he can, but if he does, he's going to lose a pawn. Let's say, for instance, h6, trying to drive the knight away. We got knight takes f7, and then if the rook takes, well, you know, we take the knight there, and we want a pawn. King takes, maybe the knight looks defended, but queen h5, it's pinned, and there's not a good way to add any further defense to that knight. And if black just does some developing move, knight c6, we'll go queen h5. We're threatening mate here on h7, so h6 is pretty much forced. And then we do the same type of thing. Knight takes f7, rook takes, and then we take here. So let's say black tries to add some defense. Queen to e7, adding some defense to f7. You can recapture with the queen like that. Maybe h6 is threatened now. Here, queen h5 is a good move, and he goes here, and we'll just take, and then again we got 2 pieces hitting that knight, and so if black captures on f7, we're just going to get that knight. Better move here might be knight f4 takes, but still we want a pawn with an overwhelming advantage like so. Our development's much better. Even better back here than queen to h5 may have been queen g4 too. That's what the computer suggests. Just keeping the pressure on, adding more attack to this knight. In this next position, it's white to move. What would you play? All right, this one's kind of hard to spot. The best move here is b5, but the idea is fairly simple. We just want to put our bishop on b4, and black's going to have a lot of trouble castling. For instance, if you go knight f6, bishop b4, how are you going to castle now? It's a little tough. You don't want to castle on the queen side with this open rook. So maybe a better try is something like knight to e7, bishop b4, and you can't castle or you lose the knight, so maybe you play queen d4 to try to add some protection. But now white's development's much better, so there's moves like this, queen d4, with the dual threats of taking on g7 and taking on a7. So yeah, that's how white gets an overwhelming advantage. Here it's black to move. What would you play? And it kind of looks like white's in the driver's seat here. The knight is threatened, and if the knight moves, it looks like the rook's gonna infiltrate and cause black some inconvenience over here. But the best move is actually knight to e2. And now, if the rook moves forward, let's say rook d7, there's going to be a checkmate in 5 moves. Rook c1 check, king g2, rook g1 check, king h3, knight f4 check, and you got king h4 followed by g5 check, mate. So that's not working out. And black's idea here is that we want to move to c5 and pick up this pawn here. The point being, with the knight on e2, anytime f4 is played, the knight's just going to capture the pawn. So what can white do here? Maybe white would like to go here and give his king more escape squares over here. We go rook c5, rook d8 check, and you move the king. If he tries to do this, well, we can play a5. Everything's protected and this pawn's going away. Are there any other possible defensive ideas for white? Maybe he can try to go here, attack the knight, knight f4, okay. Now we still have this move coming. Maybe you want to move the bishop back. Now this pawn's defended by the rook, but we got rook to d8, and we're going to infiltrate like this. So yeah, all variations heavily favor black. Black to move here, what would you play? All right, this one's fairly straightforward. We want to win the e5 pawn. So we eliminate the defender, f4. White has no way to defend that f4 pawn, so you capture. H takes g5, and now this pawn is going away. There's no defense. Black wins a pawn. Here it's black to move. What would you play? So black's worst piece here is obviously the bishop on b7, so we want to be looking for ways that we can get away with playing c5, which we can actually do right now. c5. You might think it loses a pawn, but after d takes c5, the point is we got knight takes c5 with the discovered attack on the d3 bishop. Takes. The material has equalized, and this bishop has a nice open diagonal now. Same thing happens if b takes c5. We'll just capture on c5 with the knight. Same thing. Let's look at knight takes b5. Here we get the pawn on b4. So in all variations, we don't lose a pawn, and this bishop is a much better piece than it was before we played c5. White to move, what would you play? Okay, the crushing move here is queen to f4, which carries some nasty threats. So obviously we're looking to take on c7, after which we'll be threatening the knight, but it's worse than it might even seem on the surface, because let's say you try to do something like queen takes b2, so that after queen takes c7, black can take. Maybe black won a piece. Nope, we got queen takes d8 check, knight takes d8, and then this is checkmate. So we have back rank problems too. So what can black do about that? Maybe you want to try rook to c8. Nope, that doesn't help. Queen takes c7. Again, if the rook captures, that's going to be checkmate. So that's not working. Maybe you'd like to give your king a little escape square. Queen takes c7. Well, the knight's under attack. How do you defend it? Queen c4. Well, now we got d5, and the rook's going to fall if the knight moves. So there's really no good defense. Maybe the best here is just queen c4 right away, queen takes c7, and then just get the rook out of dodge. But here white's won a pawn, and his pieces are a lot more active. So white is definitely winning here. Here it's black to move. What would you play? All right, if you're looking for ways to trap the white queen, you're on the right track. If you found d4, you're absolutely correct. The point being that this opens up this square d5 for the black knight, and it simultaneously threatens the knight on c3. So white's pretty much going to have to give up a knight in order to save his queen. If you just move the knight, let's say to e4, we got knight d5, and the queen's trapped. So you can do this, and then, you know, we take the knight here, and then the queen could take on d4. But, you know, the pawn isn't enough for the lost knight. Maybe just f6, defending the knight there. Black's winning. Or you just play knight takes d4 right off the bat. Knight takes d4. Okay, so you get a pawn for your minor piece. Maybe grab another pawn like this, but then we take on c2, so that's no good. So in all variations, black has a winning game.